All right, now that you know what JSON placeholder is, let me show you how to write code to get all these posts objects from JSON placeholder and display them on a page. So back in VS Code, I'm going to start with a new component called posts component. Now the first step to consume HTTP services is to go to app.module. And here in the imports array, we need to import a new module. That is HTTP module. Let's import this. So on the top, you can see this module is defined in Angular/HTTP library. So all the classes for working with HTTP services are encapsulated in this module. Now let's go to our posts component. Here I'm going to add a constructor. And in this constructor, I'm going to add a parameter called HTTP of type HTTP. Let's import this class on the top. So once again, you can see this class is also defined in Angular/HTTP library. Whether we want to get the data or save the data, we use this HTTP class to send HTTP requests to the backend. Now, before going any further, let's go back to the browser and make sure everything works up to this point. So here's our home page. And in the console, we don't have any errors. Now, let me show you what happens if you forget the first step. That was importing the HTTP module. So back in app module, I'm going to comment out this line where we import the HTTP module. Save. Back in the browser. Okay, we got this error. No provider for HTTP. You have seen this error earlier in the course. We got this error because here in our posts component, we have injected this HTTP class, but we have not registered this as a provider. So dependency injection in Angular doesn't work unless you register all these dependencies as providers. So back in app module, here in the providers array, we should add the HTTP class. Because this class has other dependencies, and we don't want to list them all here because this is very repetitive and it's not the best practice. So that's why we import the HTTP module. So this module, just like our app module here, is a class defined in Angular. It has the ng module decorator applied to it, and it also has this providers array where all classes used in dependency injection are registered. So by simply importing this module here, all the dependency injection is set up properly. Okay? All right, now let's go back to our posts component. I'm going to use this HTTP object to send a request to our backend. So http.get, and with this we can send an HTTP GET request to the server. We use this kind of request to get some data from the server. Okay? Now, as the argument here, we need to set the URL. So let's go back to the browser. Here on JSON placeholder, I'm going to copy this URL here. So JSON placeholder.typecode.com/posts. Copy. Back here, paste. Now look at the return type of this get method. It returns an observable of response. What is this observable? Well, earlier I told you that we use promises and observables to work with asynchronous or non-blocking operations. So here we're going to go over the network, we're going to call the server, and the data is not available immediately. There's going to be some delay, maybe 10 milliseconds, maybe half a second, maybe 5 seconds, who knows. And during this time, we don't want the main thread that is executing this code to get blocked. Okay? So we use promises and observables, and with these classes, when the result is ready, we'll be notified. Now, promises and observables have some differences. For now, don't worry about them. All I want you to know now is that this observable has a method called subscribe. So we can chain a method call here, dot subscribe. And with this, we're basically subscribing to this observable. So when the result is ready, we'll be notified. Okay? Now, this subscribe method has 3 overloads, which basically means there are 3 ways we can use this subscribe method. If you press the up and down arrows, you can see different overloads of the subscribe method. And each overload has different parameters. The one that we're going to use is the third overload here. So here we have two parameters, next and error. And as you can see with this question mark, they're both optional. Now look at the type of the next parameter. We have an arrow function here. So this function takes a value, which is a response, and it returns void. So here I can pass an arrow function, response goes to a code block. So this is what we call a subscription function. And here I will have access to this response. So let's simply display it on the console. Response, like this. Now back in the browser. So here in the console, this is our response object. You can see the status is 200, which means okay. We also have these headers here if we need to access them. Now, most of the time, we're not going to use this response object in this raw form. We want to convert this to a JSON object because we're going to use these JSON objects to display data in our views. So back here, this response object has a method called JSON. And with this, we can convert the response to a JSON object. Now in this demo, because we're working with multiple posts, when we call the JSON method, we'll get an array of posts. Let's have a look. So back in the browser, look, we get an array of posts. And here's the first post. We have 4 properties: body, ID, title, and user ID. So back here, I'm going to define a field, posts, of type any array. And instead of logging this response.json on the console, I'm simply going to set this.posts to response.json. That's it. Now we can go to our template and render all these posts using a bunch of list items. So let's go to posts.html. Here I'm going to add a UL with the class list-group. Once again, this is a bootstrap class that we use for presentation only. It's not required. It's purely for giving our UL a nice look and feel. Now, inside this UL, we need an LI with the class list group item. Now, finally, we can iterate over our posts using the ng4 directive. So let post of posts. And then here we can use the interpolation to render the title of each post. So post the title. That's all we had to do. Back in the browser. So here are all the posts that we retrieved from JSON placeholder as our backend. Now in your applications, instead of JSON placeholder, you have your own backend. Maybe you build that backend or another developer in the team. But as an Angular developer, all you need to do is to use this HTTP class to send the request to that backend. So this is how we get data from the server.